morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, November 30th, 2020. I hope you had an amazing, happy, healthy, safe Thanksgiving weekend, whether you spent it with friends, family, by yourself. It doesn't matter. I just hope you had a great weekend, and I'm so glad that you're here with me today. Thank you so much for being here. And on this episode, I'm going to talk about the notion of the Constitution as a living and breathing document. What that means, where it really gained traction in the early 20th century, and how different that notion is from what the founders and ratifiers gave us in the original legal meaning of the Constitution. I've also got some quotes from Samuel Adams, James Otis, James Madison, Richard Henry Lee, and probably some other fun stuff. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. You can find all the archives of this show. We've done it for over 2 years. And on individual episodes, I include an overview of the episode. I include all the other platforms you can find us on. We've got different video platforms, live streaming, archive. We also have podcast editions on Apple, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, and all those other platforms as well. And then you can also find links that I mentioned. So when I talk about a source document or a speech in a convention, for example, I will link to that as often as I actually have a web version available in those show notes. So you can research, read, and learn more on your own time. You can also find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Thank you for any consideration you can give to that. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we're waiting for everyone to get their notifications on the live platforms, they tend to send them out in batches. I don't really know how it ends up working. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't. But we always like to give people a few minutes to get the notifications and join us on the live stream. And I appreciate you here, whether you're here for the live stream or later on in the archive. Thank you so much. But in the meantime, let me say a quick hello to people. Tyler B., good to see you, man. Patricia Dance, always good to see you as well. Patricia, Dixie Strong, same to you. To everybody, really. Clay Kent, Melissa Harrell, MRGF, Southern Gent, Tim Martin made it. Good to see you, man. Wyatt, Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty, Walter, Hoppian, that's a pretty cool screen name. NBG, Hoppian, Lawrence Smith, Justin Morrison, Funky Euphemism, Setuni, Jack Shepard, Dan Reed, good to see you, man. Hope you had a good holiday. We got to catch up. Ian, Kenna, and everyone else, I apologize if I missed you. I will try to take a look at the live chat a little bit later in the show if I don't ramble on too long. If not, I always read through the comments later on in the day and reply to as many as possible. I think I can, lately I've only been able to reply on YouTube, for example, to the archive comments, but wherever you are, please continue leaving comments, and I read through everything and get a lot of ideas for the show in the future. But let's start out. I want to start out with an important quote that was drafted, that was part of a document called the Massachusetts Circular Letter. This was in 1768, and it was co-authored by Samuel Adams and his great friend James Otis Jr. I'm not sure who the primary author is, but on this image here, I've got Samuel Adams. Let me pull this up. And here's how they put it. In all free states, the Constitution is fixed. And I'll give them a little bit more context for that in a few minutes. But I want to focus on that word fixed. If you think of a fixed meaning, a fixed document, it has a very specific meaning. But that's not how a lot of people, in fact, probably most people, when you get down to it, even when they say they think it's fixed, it's very malleable. People don't see it as a fixed document, the Constitution for the United States, that is. They see it as a living, breathing document. And here from Mike Meharry in an article that he published back in 2015 on the TAC website, he describes it this way. By living and breathing, they mean the Constitution was written as a dynamic document. Flexible, so it can change with the times. Now, mind you, it is flexible, but through a very specific process outlined in the Constitution in the amendment process. Not just flexible in its legal meaning. They actually say, when they're saying it's living and breathing, they mean flexible in how the words unchanged actually apply to different times, different eras. He says, instead of maintaining a fixed meaning, judges, lawmakers, and bureaucrats mold its various clauses and provisions to fit the needs of the day. And generally the needs of the day means whatever the hell they want. Whoever has power, who wants to expand power or make justification for their own power, they will mold it to fit whatever their goals are. And as long as enough people support them or don't oppose them, which happens on both sides of the political spectrum all day long, they'll continue getting away with this and set the precedent for more and more in the future. Now, where does it come from? It really gained a lot of traction in the early 20th century, as I said in the outset. But Meharry points out that it was Woodrow Wilson. What a surprise. That guy was a monster. He was one of the first politicians to define and aggressively advocate this idea of a living, breathing document in his book, Constitutional Government in the United States, while stumping on the campaign trail in 1912. Now, he wasn't the first. He didn't create the idea out of thin air, but he certainly popularized it. And we know 1913 was a seriously bad year for the Constitution and liberty, but here's how Woodrow Wilson put it in that book in 1912. He says, "Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not of mechanics. It must develop. All that progressives ask or desire is permission in an era when development, evolution, is the scientific word, to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle." And I've read through a lot of the ratification debates and the Philadelphia Convention, the notes and things like that. And I've read through a lot of documents, pro and con, Federalist, anti-Federalist papers. I didn't notice anyone. I mean, I know it wouldn't have been, but there was nothing even close to the idea of Darwinian in how they actually said we should read the Constitution. But that's how Woodrow Wilson wanted us to read it, and that's how most people read it today. All they ask, he writes, is a recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. I mean, some of it sounds logical, but to apply it to a legal document is a whole different story. Now, back to another article from Meharry earlier this year, he points out that at its core, the American Revolution was a constitutional crisis. We know that the British system of government, they referred to it as the Constitution. We know that Samuel Adams, James Otis Jr. were talking about a constitution having a fixed meaning back in 1768, but there was no written constitution. It was an unwritten constitution. Meharry talks about it a little bit further in this article. He says, the system of government during the colonial era was a constitutional system, but not in the same sense Americans think of today. The Constitution was not written, and in the British system, no distinction existed between the Constitution or frame of government and the system of laws. They were one in the same. And because of that, every act of Parliament was, in essence, part of the Constitution. It was an absurdity to argue that an act of Parliament was unconstitutional, although we started to see that type of thing come up in the 1760s, of course, further than that, 1770s and more. He says, since it was sovereign, anything Parliament did was, by definition, constitutional. In fact, parliamentary acts became part of the constitutional structure. And he points out that really that is a great way to define what they mean by living, breathing constitution. Now, that doesn't mean that just the assumption that whatever Congress does is constitutional does actually have a strong support in the way people act today. In fact, people treat the Constitution as, well, whatever they do, if they do something, we have to follow it until the Supreme Court tells it's okay, that it's violated the Constitution, and we no longer have to follow it. So in other words, we're waiting on the government to tell us what is constitutional and not the other way around. And Mike points out that the British system operated based on this living, breathing Constitution idea, formed and defined by the Constitution or by the government itself. But in the years leading up to the American Revolution, views started to really change, and instead of government creating the Constitution and being on top of the food chain, they really started to see things the other way around. And back to that paper, the Massachusetts Circular Letter, here's that full quote from James Otis Jr. and Samuel Adams. Again, in all free states, the Constitution is fixed. And as the supreme legislative, they talk about supreme, they're talking about Parliament. As the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution. So they're reasserting, they're reforming this. It's not the other way around. They're saying, this is our Constitution, and you get that authority from it. the legislative cannot overleap the bounds of it without destroying its own foundation. This is one of the most important early documents in this change of views of sovereignty in American political thought on the notion of constitutionalism as well. Now, Thomas Paine was also noticing this as well. He wrote about it in Rights of Man, which was published in 1791. And Meharry, in another article, we've got tons from him today. He says he captured the essence of American constitutionalism that evolved during the Revolution, characterizing the Pennsylvania Constitution as a political Bible. That was Paine's actual phrase for it. He saw the Pennsylvania Constitution as, quote, a political Bible. And here's how Paine put it. Nothing was more common when any debate rose on the principles of a bill or on the extent of any species of authority than for members to take the printed Constitution out of their pocket. My pocket Constitution, this kind of idea of having a pocket Constitution and reading it, this goes all the way back to the pre-revolutionary days of the early part of the American Revolution, the War for Independence, and the Pennsylvania State Constitution, or the Colonial Constitution, whatever you want to call it. They would take it out of their pocket, read the chapter with which such matter in debate was connected. That's how Paine put it again. That was in Rights of Man in 1791. So I agree with how Meharry put it. And we've been saying this for a number of years. I think both of us actually got the idea for the phrase from the great Kevin Gutzman, who's a great historian, researcher, and author. And here's how Meharry put it. He says, a living, breathing Constitution is really a dead Constitution. America's founding document, he writes, essentially serves as a contract between the people of the several states. Through the Constitution, they formed a union, set up a general government to administer specific objects, and delegated to it specific enumerated powers. And Meharry is absolutely correct. He said you can't have a living, breathing contract. I think about my rental contract, and I have a very fixed rental contract, and I pay a certain amount of money every, well, mine's 15 months, but I pay a certain amount, and all of a sudden 3 months down the line, they're like, well, actually, you know, the way we're reading that amount with inflation, it really means you have to pay an extra $250. And that's really kind of how he sums it up here. He says, think about it. Would you sign a living, breathing mortgage? Would you enter into a living, breathing employment contract? Would you sign a living, breathing agreement with a builder to put an addition on your house? He's speaking from the view of a homeowner, at least at the time, rather than us renters. But it's the same kind of a concept. There are certain things which you know could change, but you understand what those parameters are really in advance. You're not saying, well, we're going to supply you with a refrigerator, and then all of a sudden they say, well, refrigerator really just means a crate with ice. And that's how it means, what it means to us today. And we are in control of it. And if you don't like it, you can just leave, too bad. And that's another example. Well, we have so many examples how we can put that out. And Meharry puts it this way. In contract law, the parties' understanding at the time of the agreement dictates its legal meaning, how they understood that contract at the time it was signed, given legal force. And that's why I so often talk about the state ratifying conventions. A lot of people want to talk about the founders' intent as driving the original legal meaning of the Constitution. That's kind of an old notion. Now, the founders' intent is very important. You want to understand where they came from. We have to understand what they did at the Philadelphia Convention for many reasons. We also have to understand how they explained it to people in response to opposition. But what gave it legal force? The legal force is how the people who ratified it, the people of the several states, how they understood the document to mean in law. It has nothing to do with just the intention. So you can have an intention from a guy like Alexander Hamilton, who said one thing during the New York ratifying convention. He was talking about expressly delegated powers. Anything outside of expressly delegated powers, he said, would be void. That sounds like a tenther. It sounds very Jeffersonian. But as soon as he has a chance, once it's ratified, all of a sudden, all kinds of things. He said there wasn't going to be implied powers, and then all of a sudden he wants a national bank. And then there's all kinds of implied powers. So if the intention of someone like Alexander Hamilton was to scam everybody, of course you're going to say, well, government should be much larger than it is today, largest in the history of the world. So original legal meaning is the understanding of the parties to the contract at the time that it was given legal force. He says a bank can't just come along and say, well, dear customer, we're changing the interest rate on your mortgage. If you have a fixed interest rate, fixed mortgage, they can't just all of a sudden say, well, it was 3%, now it's 30%. Just because times have changed. And we don't see the meaning of the contract the same way anymore. Please remit an extra $200 a month with your next payment. The same thing goes for a rental contract. They're just not going to be able to change it at the time. That's not going to hold up in law. And James Madison talked about this, and I've cited this letter a number of times. I will include a link to this, plus the circular letter, plus all of Meharry's articles, so you can read more than just the excerpts that I'm covering here on this episode. But this is a letter to, I believe, Henry Lee in June of 1824. And I know it's kind of small on the screen. Let me see if I can pull it up full screen. Maybe it'll be a little bit bigger. Not much, but let me read this for you guys. I entirely concur. This is James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution. I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. That's just reiterating, or it was me reiterating what Madison was saying in 1824. In order to understand what the Constitution means, you have to understand how they understood it when it was ratified. He says, in that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. And if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers. So if the government itself can determine the meaning of the document that created it by the people of the states, then government is always going to change it based on how government wants to. And if you combine that with the maxim, the notion, not even just some notion, it is a historical truth. It's a fact that power always seeks to expand. And all the founders understood this. These days, of course, a lot of people who recognize that power expands, they think it's a great thing. They want more power, more centralized power over everything. So the problem is they think power is good, but power is really, really dangerous. Madison goes further to Henry Lee. He says, if the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject. In other words, a word in 1800 could have a totally different meaning in 1900, in 2000, 2300, whatever. It's just going to have different uses over time. Excuse me. He goes on. He says, what a metamorphosis would be produced in the code of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. And that's really, really important to understand. So anything other than that, a fixed original meaning replaced by a meaning decided by the government itself, the founders called that arbitrary government, arbitrary power, and the very definition of tyranny. Now here's Richard Henry Lee in the Virginia Ratifying Convention basically putting those two concepts together. What Madison talked about, how to understand and read and know the original legal meaning of the document, and then also this idea of arbitrary power when you don't follow it. He says, when a question arises with respect to the legality of any power exercised or assumed by Congress, it is plain on the side of the government. Question, is it enumerated in the Constitution? If it be, it is legal and just. If it is otherwise arbitrary and unconstitutional. Arbitrary, basically just exercised on the whim of those in power. We saw that phrase as well, arbitrary power. Even in the Declaration of Independence, arbitrary power was the great concern, because when government can change the rules, of course, government will always expand, and liberty is constantly under threat. Thomas Paine talked about this. Even in December, in the American crisis, December of 1776, when people were concerned, uh-oh, this may not be going too well, and he's trying to urge people to push on. He's like, look, even if they sound like they're going to reconcile with us, they're still claiming the power to do things over us, to have power over us in all cases whatsoever. That is arbitrary power. So even if they were to agree to demands today, they're taking this power in the future and they're claiming the power over anything and everything whenever they want, all the time. And there is no way out other than to win this war, to free ourselves from the shackle of the empire. And that was a great concern. Even in 1776, people had been concerned about this power over anything, all cases whatsoever, for a number of years. But that was a rallying cry. And here in the Declaration of Independence, which came months earlier, obviously, Jefferson and others, they point out that all the things, this pretended legislation, for example, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government. Part of the Declaration of Independence is opposed to an arbitrary government, one without rules or limitations, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. An arbitrary government is one with absolute rule. Without limits, it is a total tyranny. Now, another speech by Samuel Adams, this was, the first one was a letter. This was a speech at a Boston town meeting, May 3rd, 1780. This is how I want to sum it up, and I think it really means a great deal. Adams put it this way: power without any restraint is tyranny. This is the one that I don't actually have a link to. I caught it in a great book on Samuel Adams by Mark Pulls, I believe his name. Again, power without any restraint is tyranny. So if government can define its own power, if government itself can determine the extent of its own power, that is no restraint, because government will always seek to expand its own power. And even if it's not acting like a tyranny or a despotism, just the nature of that is tyrannical, because let's say you like the people who are exercising that arbitrary power today. Eventually, other people are going to come in and use that power in ways that you don't like in the future. And that's why strict, fixed limits, fixed legal meaning, that's what can create an opportunity for liberty to flourish. And that's why the founders set up that type of system in the Constitution for the United States. Now, taking a look over at the live chat and see a few questions, see if there's anything interesting here. There's a lot of back and forth. Jay Armstrong points out, and again, this is actually the supremacy clause really gets to this, and I think this is what Jay Armstrong is talking about on Facebook. He says the text is clear. Everything must be pursuant, if contrary, pursuant to the Constitution. So in order for a federal act, a federal law to be supreme, it has to be done in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution. But again, here comes the rub. Here's the problem of how we face things today. People believe that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court says it means until the Supreme Court changes its mind. That in and of itself, just saying, well, we have to wait for the Supreme Court to tell us whether Obamacare is unconstitutional. We have to wait. We have to wait for the Supreme Court to tell us whether the National Firearms Act of 1934 is unconstitutional. That means government is telling us, it is dictating to us what its own power is, when it really should be the other way around. The people of the several states should be the ones at the top of the food chain. Funky Euphemism also points out that the idea of the Darwinian Constitution, this is the, oh, this is really interesting. This is the Lochner case. I love your insight here, man. Thank you so much. The Darwinian Constitution that Woodrow Wilson was talking about in 1912 actually came out of the Lochner versus New York case in 1905, part of Oliver Wendell Holmes' Obiter Dictum. Oh, just throwing it out there. If you want to write an article on that, we would absolutely be interested in that, because I don't really know a lot about that. And I'd love to actually learn about that Lochner case and this Darwinian Constitution a little bit as well. Liberty Firearms over on Twitch. I really appreciate you joining us on that platform. Happy Monday. Clay Kent says, if we allow sounds reasonable changes, little by little, the rules and how the game is played, soon the original game ceases to be the game being played. And let me see if I can pull this up. Here's Washington's farewell address. Here it is. He says, if in the opinion, this is George Washington's farewell address. It was drafted originally by James Madison in 1792, because Washington really only wanted to spend one term in office. He was convinced to stay around. He was convinced that he needed to be there to kind of keep the, we don't want to call them warring sides yet, but the factions at peace. So he was convinced to stay. Hamilton did a rewrite of it, but it was based on Washington's instructions. 1796. He says, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any way particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. Short version, what I was trying to say earlier is really just a repeat of what George Washington was saying. George Washington, even Hamilton and James Madison were saying in 1796. That is, if you don't like the limitations on the government, the federal government in the Constitution, don't just exercise the power anyways. There's actually a process to change that. Now, if you can't convince enough people that what you want the government to do, you don't just force it through. That in and of itself is a problem. And that's called usurpation. Exercising power which was not authorized or delegated to the government in the Constitution is usurpation or theft. You think of the usurper on the crown, anyone who's stealing something is a usurper. He says, but let there be no change by usurpation. For though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Again, even if you like the short-term outcome, George Washington warned us, do not turn a blind eye to an exercise of power not delegated. Always oppose it. Oppose it unless you get the amendment to authorize that additional power. Oppose it all the time, even if you like the short-term results. Why? Because that's how free governments are destroyed. And I would say we do not, it's the largest government ever. The U.S. government, I know a lot of people are saying, oh, we're going to stop socialism. This is just absurd to me. The U.S. federal government, so-called federal, it's absurd to call it a federal government. It's a national, centralized power. It's the largest ever in history as far as spending goes. There's some other metrics we can use as well, but it spends almost 8 times as much as the socialist state of China. So if you're going to stop socialism, I think the first thing, whether you're left or right or whatever, isn't just to pick one team or another. It's literally to just start opposing and resisting just about anything and everything that's on the books that shouldn't exist. So basically all of it. Again, that's getting a little off track here. I think it was a great point made by Jay, who's up there at below zero in Alaska. I escaped that. I left the socialist state of Wisconsin for the socialist warm state of Southern California, and I got a chance to hang out in the free city of well, it seems free in comparison to the rest of LA County, but Pasadena was open for business over the weekend, and I got a chance to spend time there. But that's kind of, well, I'm just rambling on. Anyways, I'm going to scroll through this a little bit more and look for additional questions and comments. I know Frankie Diaz is asking about Lysander Spooner, who I think is an incredible author. We've actually covered his views on the trial by jury in an episode sometime in the last year or so, but I want to cover a little bit more from him as well. I did another episode on the notion that Spooner talked about in No Treason, that the Constitution wasn't assigned to anyone. It can't enforce itself. So it's either, basically the quote that a lot of people like to use is that the Constitution either authorized what we have today or was powerless to prevent it. But the idea that words on paper enforce themselves is nonsense. Words can't enforce themselves. And if we understand how the Constitution is supposed to be enforced, it's not by waving a pocket constitution at politicians who have power, who always want to expand their power, but it's also by understanding what James Madison told us in Federalist number 48, and many others told us, that what they called a mere parchment barrier would never enforce itself, but that when government got out of hand, it's up to the people to keep it in check. Government isn't going to keep itself in check, although checks and balances can help out a little bit. But if the people don't resist, James Iredell, one of the first Supreme Court justices, specifically said, when government usurps power, the people will resist. Now, he may have had too positive an outlook on how people would deal with things 100 years down the line. It should be the people should resist, but I'm not trying to change his quote on this. But I'll look through more of the comments a little bit later today. Please continue leaving those comments, whether it's live or in the archive. If you support the show, you can certainly help us spread the word. Most of the platforms, primarily the mainstream ones, like Facebook, YouTube, and others, they're very easily triggered in their algorithm. So if you smash the like button, or if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts, you leave a comment, you share, all that stuff tells the algorithm to show the program to more people. We're getting record numbers, a slow but steady increase every single month. We're getting more and more people viewing or listening to the show every single month. So I can't thank you enough for helping us spread the word. Please continue to do that. I will check out the comments later. And if you want to pitch in and support us financially, We could certainly use your help to reach and teach even more people about the Constitution and liberty. Don't feel any obligation to do so, but if you've got as little as $2 a month, you can go over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, or if you just want to make a one-time donation, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving holiday weekend. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.